Here we go. Good evening, everybody, and well, good afternoon to Omer Bartov that joins us, I suppose, from Providence, Rhode Island, right?
Or rather from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Oh, there you go. Much nicer place. Well, I am not in my home in St. Louis. I just put as a background a piece of library because I expected you to have books, and I thought I'm going to have an inferiority complex. Uh, thanks, thanks for spending an hour with us, Omer. Brief introduction in Italian, then we'll go back to English. Allora, buonasera. Questa sarebbe un face to face per gli abbonati, ma visto la rilevanza del tema e anche il piacere di avere Omer Bartov di nuovo con noi, chi fosse interessato, ci siamo visti qua in marzo e quindi lo faremo in inglese, però lo lascio aperto un po' a tutti. Omer è un professore di storia del genocidio in particolare, a Brown University e in altri posti degli Stati Uniti, è un signore di origine ovviamente israeliana che lavora e opera negli Stati Uniti. Bene, il punto lo vedete nel titolo, Quo Vadis Israel, quindi per voi che siete latinisti sapete cosa significa. I think he's understanding what I'm saying in Italian, so let's switch to English. Well, the title are there, Omer, and again, thanks for joining us. Your views, this ICJ ruling and opinion is relevant. You were mentioned to be quite relevant, somewhat historical. How do you read it? What does it say, and what impact, which effect may it have or not have at all?
So first of all, hi. Thanks for having me again. And you see my wife's office behind me because there's work being done in mine.
Beautiful one.
So thank you. So the ICJ ruling is actually quite important. In some ways, it's a breakthrough because it's the first time that the most important international court in the world has ruled that the Israeli occupation is illegal, and that it is illegal because it has continued for a very long time, longer than any occupation should continue. It's illegal because of the way Israel uses that territory, exploits it for its own needs or perceived needs. It's illegal because of the way Israel treats the population there as basically discriminates heavily against the population there. And it's illegal because Israel has transferred Israeli citizens into that occupied territory. And so, first of all, it's important because it states clearly that the occupation is illegal, and it defines the occupied territories as being the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And it makes the case that Gaza is still considered an occupied territory, which Israel is trying to deny. It also argues that this is not simply an occupation, but that this is in fact a process of annexation of territory, which of course is also in breach of international law. And therefore it calls, first of all, for the settlements to be immediately stopped and eventually dismantled, and for the occupation to be ended as soon as possible. It also calls for compensation to the population that has been under occupation. So this is a major ruling. It's the first time that a body such as the ICJ has ruled the entire occupation is illegal. Now, what are the implications of that? There's no enforcement by the ICJ. The ICJ cannot enforce its rulings. If there is enforcement, it would be done by the Security Council, that's, so to speak, the enforcement agency of the International Court of Justice. But by saying, by clearly stating and very strongly stating that this is an occupation, in fact, implying that the occupation of the West Bank is also a regime of apartheid, it means that other countries that have expressed their support for the ICJ, that feel obliged to act upon rulings by the ICJ, will have to then change their behavior toward Israel. Now, that can be all kinds of things. It can have to do with relations, economic relations with Israel. It can have to do with relations with the West Bank. It certainly may have to do with military supplies and military assistance to Israel. Many countries have their own domestic rules that forbid them from giving military support or supplies to countries which are in breach of international law. And the ICJ has said that Israel is in breach of international law. So in that sense, this may have not an immediate effect, but an ongoing effect. Additionally, the ruling by the ICJ is likely to have an impact also on the ICC, on the International Criminal Court, which is right now deliberating whether to issue warrants for the arrest of the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Minister of Defense, Netanyahu and Gallant. And I think that although these courts are not connected to each other, they are very close to each other physically, and they are two highly important international judicial entities. And I believe that may have an impact on how the ICC rules on this matter of issuing arrest warrants.
And do you think there will be follow-up to that? Let's just to this detail. Do you think the International Criminal Court may follow up to that? And do you think that that may have any bearing on action of the Security Council, given the current circumstances at the Security Council?
I don't know that I think that the ICJ has said what it said. The ICJ is also considering, of course, the question of genocide, and clearly what it said about the occupation shows its general attitude toward Israeli policies. So there may be a relationship there. It's also considering the question of apartheid. And so I think that I don't think it's likely that the ICJ can directly affect what the Security Council will do, but it does put countries in the Security Council, meaning obviously the United States, in an increasingly uncomfortable position, because the United States recognizes the ICJ, unlike the ICC, that the US is not part of. The United States is
yeah,
signatory.
you may want to explain to our listeners a bit the difference. The ICJ is de facto a branch or an institution of the United Nations, contrary to
Correct.
the ICC.
Correct. So the ICJ was the International Court of Justice was created with the creation of the UN, and so it's an agency of the UN, and its role, it has two roles. One is disputes between countries. If there's a dispute between countries, then one of the countries can appeal to the International Court of Justice. This is the case that we are seeing now, with South Africa having turned to the ICJ and saying that Israel is engaged in genocide. Israel, although it of course is not accepted this charge, respects the ICJ, and therefore the ICJ is supposed to rule on that, and it has meanwhile issued a variety of interim measures. The other role that the ICJ has, and that's the role that he played now in the case of this ruling, is as an advisory body to the UN. And the UN turned to the ICJ with the question regarding the Israeli occupation. What is the nature of that occupation? And the ICJ deliberated that for a couple of years and now came up with the statement that this is an occupation. Where is that occupation? And the extent of its legality, and rejected the entire sort of body of arguments being made over the years by Israel that it managed somehow to create a sort of fog of unclarity whether this was an occupation or not, whether it was illegal or not. The ICJ just blew all of that up and said, yes, it is, and it's illegal, and it has to stop. So that's the uh, ICJ. The International Criminal Court was created by through the Rome Statute. That is separate from the UN. Now, it doesn't mean that the UN doesn't is not connected to it, but it's not. It doesn't have the same direct relationship with the UN. This is part of international humanitarian law. And the ICC, whose creation was actually recommended during the deliberations over the Genocide Convention in 1948, was finally created only 40 years later. Whereas the ICJ rules on disputes between states, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has to do with individuals. It can identify individuals, who are in breach of international law, and when we face a situation where such individuals are not expected to be charged by their own justice systems, by their national justice systems, either because they have power over them or because there's no trust that those systems will actually produce just verdicts. And it is in those cases when the ICC determines that that is so, that it can decide to adjudicate cases against particular individuals who are involved in breaches of international law.
So, obviously, there's plenty of questions that come up. One, going back to history, to put things a bit in perspective. The situation currently in the West Bank and Gaza has always become extreme. It's probably the harshest and most violent, I guess, ever since at least the 1948 resolution. But the quality of the Israeli presence and behavior, and the quality of the response and the behavior of the Palestinian population and their organizations, it's not that different. It's quantitatively that violence has increased. Why do you think the ICJ is ruling only now that the situation on the ground is a situation of illegal occupation for East Jerusalem, again, for the West Bank and so on, and that de facto what's going on is akin or equivalent to annexation? It seems to an observer, in fact, the nation sympathetic to Israel, that this has been the case for, I don't know, maybe at least 20 years. Other would say 70. Why do you think it's taken this particular juncture to reach the resolution? Is that the South African initiative? Is that a pressure from the rest of the world? Many people here in Italy, in Europe, I suppose in the United States, who have just dismissed the ruling, say, oh, that's just a bunch of criminals that have sold out criminal states and a dictatorial government and whatnot, controlled by Iran or whatever, and therefore it has no relevance. What's your view on this, on the legitimacy of this, and what has brought the court to take this decision now?
Well, that's a lot of questions. So
it's one. Why now and not 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Then I added up a little bit of tomatoes and lettuce. But
well, I mean, first of all, let me say, although the situation now is very extreme, the situation on the West Bank, especially during the Second Intifada, was also very extreme. There was a great deal of
Right.
violence. And I would keep that in mind. That's in 2000. And I would keep that in mind because events during the Second Intifada, where there was both a great deal of suicide bombings, particularly by Hamas, with about 1,000 Israeli citizens killed, and extreme responses by the Israeli military, which killed thousands of Palestinians, had the effect of greatly radicalizing public opinion both among Palestinians and among Israeli Jews. And that's the rise both of Hamas on the side of the Palestinians and the I'd say the almost complete control of the right wing on Israeli politics since then. So that's just in terms of context. Now, why? First of all, the nature of the ICJ. The ICJ is not, as some people would like to describe it, as it's only Western judges. It's only showing the dominance of the West over the rest of the world, and so forth. The ICJ is made up of judges from the whole world, and there's some key where regions of the world have to be represented in the ICJ. So the justices there represent, by and large, the countries of the world, or the regions of the world at least. Um, it is true, of course, that until recently, um, both the ICC and the ICJ made very few rulings, and the rulings by the ICC, by and large, were about all kind of dictators in Africa and very little about what was happening in Europe, or in the developed world. And so this change is a good change. I would say it's in the right direction. But why the interest right now in what is happening in Israel? Why this ruling? Well, first of all, this ruling is a response to an appeal by the UN to the ICJ. So the ICJ has the duty when the UN asks it to advise it on the nature of the occupation, then it has to provide this advice. That's its role. But obviously, there's more to it than that. What we've seen over the past few years is a great acceleration of the so-called settlement project, and a great deterioration in the way that Israel treats its Palestinian population. And we always have to keep in mind that Israel uh, controls, um, in proper Israel and outside of it, in the occupied territories, you have more or less equal numbers. You have 7 million Jews in
Right.
Israel, plus 2 million Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, but in many ways second-class citizens. And then have 5 more million Palestinians who are under Israeli control and have been under Israeli control for 57 years. And this uh, um, settlement project under recent governments, which have become increasingly right wing and increasingly, I'd say, indifferent to world opinion, not even trying to cover up what they are doing as they have done in the past, that has brought Israel to a position, as some people in Israel itself are saying, that the occupation and the settlement are so blatant that international institutions that have not wanted to really deal with this issue have had no choice but to finally come up. And so, in a sense, you could say that it is the kind of extremism of Israeli governments, and particularly, of course, the recent Netanyahu coalitions that have brought this question to the fore. And finally, and that I wouldn't say that explains directly um, the ICJ taking this up, but it may explain the final judgment by the ICJ. Um, since October 7th, um, the the violence being exercised by the Israeli military and by settlers has been so extreme that it has become almost impossible to not say something
Ignore.
about it. Um, and and one last thing that I would add here that I think is important to keep in mind, and that's that the until October 7th, um, the Palestinian issue in general was not really on most people's radar, not in Israel, not in Europe, not in the United States. Now, again, the ICJ took up this issue earlier, of course, but I believe that that made a difference. I believe that the fact that Hamas launched this attack, heinous as it was, put the Palestinian issue right front and center, made it impossible for the international community to accept the kind of Israeli line that was, let's just ignore that issue, we can manage it, and let's deal with other things. And so I think this whole complex of reasons makes for finally what the ICJ has ruled.
Well, yeah, but the response of Israel and the response of its major partner, the US, to all this has been silence, mostly in the part of the US, with the exception of the Trump camp that has essentially backed the Netanyahu government. And the defiant answer from Netanyahu, a listener before reported citing verbatim Netanyahu from the Wall Street Journal saying nobody can uh, accuse us of occupying what is our eternal capital and our eternal land, including Samaria and so on. So basically, and then the Knesset has voted as we know. So it seems that any hope for a reason or another, and I also would like to know your evaluation. Obviously, it's going to be personal. There is no way of proving causation here, but how much of this is inevitable outcome of the way in which Israel was created and grew in the 60s and 70s, and how much is this a reaction to the mismanagement and the violence and the terror attack of the Palestinian residents during this year. But it seems that there is essentially overwhelming, if not unanimity, certainly overwhelming majority in the Israeli population say, well, the hell with it. We're going to go ahead and take over from the river to the sea, contrary to the Palestinian slogan. And we were going to do it from the Palestinian to the sea, and then we'll see what we do with these people that are around that should not be around. So, what's your view on this?
Look, yes, the U.S. has had almost nothing to say. In Israel, the response was a knee-jerk.
Biden was too busy with COVID. And
Yeah, I don't think that the current administration is having trouble just finding sea legs. So yeah, so there's been very little response in the U.S. I'm not even sure that Netanyahu is going to meet Biden. So that's sort of up in the air right now. American politics is in a very strange place at the moment. But in Israel, the response was exactly the opposite. In Israel, the response was exactly what you would expect. What are you talking about? This is our own land. There's no one is going to tell us what to do with our own land and so forth. Now, look, people can say, this is our promised land. This is, it appears in the Bible. We are coming back. That's all fine. People can say whatever they like. But legally, Israel is an occupying force in these territories. And the Bible and ideology and Zionism have nothing to do with the fact that legally Israel is in breach of international law. I would say that while the response is something that you probably would have heard already 40 years ago and did hear 40 years ago, the style of the response, the way Israel is behaving now is very different. Uh, the the sense among Israeli politicians over a long time, um, going back to shortly after 1967, if we are talking about the occupied territories of the post 1967 occupied territories, within uh, a year, 2 years, Israel got used to holding these territories. It spoke about them for a long time as bargaining chips. We'll give you the territories, you give us peace, right? Land for peace. But how much of the land, what kind of peace, that was open. Um, and gradually, Israelis and Israeli politicians got used to these occupied territories. In fact, there are whole generations of Israelis who, unlike me, who have no memory of Israel before 1967. They don't exactly know where the green line is, right? Um, so Israeli governments and Israeli parties, including very much the Labour Party, the so-called Israeli
By the way,
left.
let me say for those. Let me tell to those that are even much younger than us, incredibly younger than us, which are not many, but it's hard to be younger. The green line refers to the line of the armistice way back after the first Israeli-Arab war,
Correct. Yeah.
which allowed. So you can find the details on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Sorry, Omer, but we have a public of very young people, so some of the details are not taught at school anymore.
Yes, sorry. I mean, just the
Don't
green
worry
line
about
is the ceasefire line of 1949 that became the de facto border of Israel between 1969 and 1967,
1949.
1949 and 1967. And in 1967, Israel conquered the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Sinai Peninsula, including the Gaza Strip. And then due to peace agreement with Egypt in 1977, it withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula, and so now it keeps East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip as occupied territories. The ICJ, by the way, did not rule, as far as I could tell, about the Golan Heights. That's a whole other issue. So uh, what I'm saying is that Israeli governments, not right-wing governments, Israeli governments, Labor and Likud and the right wing, the conservatives, uh, generally were reluctant to think about returning those territories. Now, there was a moment at which, during the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, that there was actually discussion of creating some kind of Palestinian entity that would be autonomous of Israel and would exist in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And this was under the one Labor government under Yitzhak Rabin that tried to reach some kind of settlement with the Palestinians over those territories. Now that failed. Netanyahu was assassinated in 1995. Rabin was assassinated in
Rabin.
1995. Yeah. And since then, um, it has become basically increasingly a case that most Israelis don't even recognize the term occupation. When you say occupation in Israel, when you use the term kibush, occupation, you're identifying yourself as being on the left-wing margin of society. People don't even think of it that way. And therefore, when Netanyahu said what he said, he was reflecting a public sentiment. And the fact that people like, Gantz, who is in the opposition, and Lapid, the heads of the two largest opposition parties, immediately sort of rejected the whole idea of calling the occupation illegal, shows you that this reflects a much larger sentiment in Israel. Now, one has to say that while it reflects a larger sentiment in Israel, that does not mean that these people are the same, because Netanyahu now is in a coalition with people who really want to carry out ethnic cleansing, to be rid of the Palestinians in the West Bank, and in Gaza, and those who stay, they want to turn to deprive them even of whatever rights they have, even of whatever rights they have now. The center right and center left in Israel, I think, at least partners for some kind of negotiations with the Palestinian leadership. That's not the case with Netanyahu and, of course, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, the two very extreme right-wing ministers who are now in his coalition. So, you know, on the one hand, there is, I would say, a consensus in the Israeli public that, well, this territory belongs to us, but there's a problem with it because there's a lot of Arabs in it. What do we do with that? On that, there's a kind of consensus. And then what do you do about it? There's less of a consensus. The right would like to basically scare them away or push them away or ethnically cleanse them. And the center says, well, we have to find some other arrangement, likely the way that Israel has been behaving now with the Palestinian Authority. That is, that you have some autonomous Palestinian Authority, which is under the thumb of the Israeli rule, and does all the dirty work for the Israelis, and is given some kind of autonomy, but basically the Israeli army can move in whenever it wants to.
Well, so let's get down to the, I mean, it's not forecasting, but how can I say, brutal or realistic. This situation has been going on for a while. There is a sense, I assume the responsibility for this, but I think I put it in writing way back when Sharon decided to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Then, in fact, that was a tactical move. Anybody that knows the history of Israeli politics and Likud, and before that, the revisionist view, knows that there is a growing, and it's been growing steadily for a century, sentiments and view and conviction, which is halfway between religious and real politics, that it has to be the great Israel, and eventually the transfer problem has to be solved in a way or another. It's every day more common to hear friends that in the past had very different position, even actively participate in the Dove movement and so on, and say, well, they're Arabs. Why they don't go back, whatever that meant, to some Arab country? Realistically and tragically, then I will ask you about Europe and the West and what the consequence of this may be. But before doing that, let's just, in some sense, there is more coherence in the racist Netanyahu right-wing position, which is an appeal to religion, an appeal to a God-given land, and the necessity of getting rid of these 5.5, 6 million strange individuals that want to live there. Then I haven't been talking a lot recently with Israeli friends. I'm sure you talked more than me, because they end up, honestly, on a very personal basis, bubbling, saying, well, it's all Netanyahu's fault. If Netanyahu was nicer, we would have figured out a solution. When you say, okay, but, Chaim, Itzhaki, whatever, what's the solution? Oh, well, the Palestinians right now are intractable. They're all Hamas. There is no way out. It's not our fault. At least the Netanyahu position is coherent in its brutality. So what's your view? Well, I'm sure you talk to your friends and family. I mean, you have, infinitely more relation than me and better understanding. What do they expect? That 5.5 million people will go jump into the Mediterranean and swim?
So look, I mean, I think first of all, your diagnosis is correct. That you have people like Netanyahu and the people that he now has around him, the religious right, the particular extremists, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who know what they want. They may not be in total agreement with each other. I think Netanyahu at least was in the past savvier as a politician, but basically they know what they want. And then you have a lot of Israelis who, right now, because of the war, but even before the war, during the judicial coup and so forth, said, oh, Netanyahu is terrible. We have to get rid of him, and we have to get rid of Smotrich and Ben Gvir. And when you ask them, okay, so what about the occupation? Well, that's not the right time to talk about it. We first have to get rid of those people. I've been to these demonstrations in Israel. The demonstrations are about maybe a ceasefire, maybe returning the hostages, maybe getting rid of the government. Nobody talks about the occupation. And the occupation is the reason for why we have violence. Hamas wasn't just created ex nihilo. Hamas is a result of the occupation. One has to understand it. These are resistance organizations. They may not be nice. They may be criminal. They may do horrible things. But the reason that they exist is that Palestinians are being oppressed. And the Israeli public, and I hear it every day, they talk, what will happen with Yemen? What will happen with Hezbollah? What will happen with Iran? And they do not want to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the occupation. So there has
Right.
been a process of just denial of the main problem of Israeli society. And it is not only a problem in the sense of what do you do with those people, it is also a problem in the sense that it has eroded whatever democracy there was in Israel. It has brutalized Israeli society. These soldiers who behave as brutally as they do now in Gaza are soldiers who spent, all their service as policemen over Palestinians. These are young men and women who find it completely normal to break into people's home at 4:30 in the morning, wake up their babies, humiliate their grandparents simply because they are the occupiers and that side are the occupied. So it's a brutalizing process, and there's a complete denial of that in Israeli society. Of course, there's some people who are against the occupation. Of course, there is some kind of opposition, but we're speaking about very small numbers. So I think you are diagnosing the issue correctly. I think, however, that the current government, because of a variety of factors that we can talk about, has responded in such a way to what happened on October 7th, and is behaving with such arrogance and with such brutality and with such indifference to the international community, including to the United States, that it is actually digging in many ways its own hole. Israel, from one day to the next, is becoming weaker, not stronger. It's becoming weaker in terms of its internal politics. The government is incompetent. Things are just not working. It's becoming weaker because its military has been unable to resolve any of the issues that it said it would resolve after October 7th with all its bravado. It's becoming weaker because it's now facing more and more enemies on more and more sides. It's becoming weaker because, as we said before, the international community now is paying attention to what all kind of international judicial instances are saying, and are becoming increasingly uncomfortable providing military and, of course, also diplomatic, political help to Israel. So it's becoming more and more isolated. Now, I was born and raised in Israel, and I don't want to see that country go down the tubes, but its own leaders are leading it in that direction. So they may have the power now to destroy Gaza, to kill 40,000 and probably far more Palestinians there. They can go and bomb Beirut, but Israeli deterrence has actually been largely eroded. Part of the issue that people do speak to some extent about in Israel is that the people who were responsible for the total fiasco of October 7th are still in place. The prime minister is still there. The minister of defense is still there. The chief of staff is still there. Most of the divisional commanders are still there. When you have such a huge fiasco and you then just continue playing along the rules, then you cannot resolve the issue, not even on the most basic level. When Netanyahu says total victory, what he means is endless war. That's what he means. And he wants endless war because the minute the war ends, he may end up in jail. And so you have now a
But
country.
let me interrupt you with a bit of emotional part on my part, and I perceive yours. Lots of people like that, Omer. That's something that strikes me as tragic, and because most people see the Israeli continuing endless war of destruction with the Palestinian, the inability over more than half century to recognize the existence of these human beings and their right to live on that land as part of a much more global struggle against the Islamic threat. If I look at the right, both in Europe, which I know, but also in the United States, I would say it's even worse in Europe. It might be because I know the European right better than I know the American one, even if I live there a long time, but I live in a fairly, like protected environment where certain characters don't,
Yeah.
well, they appear, but very, very seldom. And so I'm not exposed to here in Italy, in Spain, in France. I see a different section of society, and I notice an enormous support for an eternal war that is perceived as a form of gigantic crusade against a threat, which is called the Muslim threat that wants to invade Europe. And I mean, there are aspects of risk in there that are concerned. I'm not saying everything is made up of pure intolerance, but what scares me is that the support for Israel in this is actually more widespread than one may think, and this may cause worse tragedies in the future. I don't know how you perceive that. It goes beyond the conflict in Gaza and the West Bank. That's a feeling I have.
Yeah, and I think you're right. But there's a difference between supporting um, violence against other people because you don't like them or because you think that they're, subhuman or malign or whatever you think about them, and you generalize about whole groups, and actually doing it. Uh, Most people in Israel today are in a very different place. There is a sense of deep insecurity in Israel, of fear, of um, confusion. Um, so I would not say that the Italian fascists may be, or French fascists, or German fascists may be enjoying this and saying, "Great, the Jews are killing Arabs or Muslims." But in Israel, that's a bit different. I sat and spoke with Israeli students recently at a university in Israel. Most of those students were very right wing. They in fact came to disrupt my lecture, which they succeeded in doing. But then I sat down and talked with them,
I
and
see.
they had most of them had just returned from reserve service in Gaza, and my estimation was, yes, they said we are not murderers. Why are you saying that we are committing genocide? And they showed me pictures of how well they've behaved with children. They were in denial of what they themselves were seeing and doing, but they also appeared to me to be mostly suffering from PTSD. And there's been actually a huge rise in soldiers coming from the army, of soldiers in need of mental help. Uh, they they appear to me to be, I mean, I would say there's two sides to this. One side is that I think um, they were very distraught by what they were involved in. The other is that because I think that they were very distraught and they felt very isolated and they felt that the public was not understanding them, not even in Israel, I could imagine them becoming the political soldiers of another kind of fascist regime in Israel. I had
I
echoes
see. You're
thinking about.
describing something that you're describing something that Italians know very well, the effort of World War One.
Exactly. So it's like the Freikorps in Germany
Or
or
by the
the.
Freikorps in Germany, exactly.
Exactly. So this sense that we were stabbed in the back by the left, by the Jews, by the communists, by all those traitors, and I told them, I was speaking with them. I said, in 1930, the National Socialists took over the student union in Germany. So 3 years before Hitler came to power, the students were taken over by the National Socialists. They just voted for them. And they did it because they felt that Germany had been humiliated and had been betrayed, and they wanted to make Germany great again. And they supported Hitler. And Hitler did that, right? He came to power. He made Germany great again. There was no unemployment. Germany was respected again by the world. It then won back its lost territories. And then it went to war and it occupied all of Europe and it killed millions of people. And then it was destroyed. And I said to them, however many of those students were still alive in 1945, because many of them died as soldiers, might have thought that maybe we made the wrong choice in 1930. Maybe this wasn't the right path. But I think that, and of course, the students I was talking with didn't quite get the point. So they didn't get the analogy. But I think that you have a process in Israel now. It's not exactly the people are in love with the war. There is the Israeli instinct of mourning, of every day, soldiers are killed, and every day the news media is filled with their stories, and then they are buried and forgotten, right? The sense of self-victimization that even as we are
the process
carrying out.
that part is very well understood. There is a continuous appeal to the tragedy of their, in some sense, at this point, almost ancestors, certainly grandparents, very few parents, and so on. And and there is a sense of you just hate us, and therefore we are forced to behave. I have witnessed that myself repeatedly with dear friends. I mean, let's forget. Let's not go personal. But at a societal level, this is the dramatic phenomenon because, and let's go back to more general politics. Where is this going to go? Because I mean, something will have to be done. Something will have to be done, and if that something to be done is the continuing, and at this point, after the, by the way, what are the practical implications in terms of next step of the Knesset ruling on the territory and on the fact that they refuse any consideration of a Palestinian state? Does that mean that there's going to be changes in the administrative status of the occupied territory, and that they're going to overrule and cancel the residual Palestinian Authority? What do you think it's going to be the next step? I mean, that vote cannot be only a symbolic vote. It has to be prodromic to some actual action, right? I suppose that's, if I were Netanyahu and I wanted to stay in power, that's what I would do. I would escalate to cause similar confrontation in the West Bank. I mean, I have been saying this for 9 months. It's quite clear that after Gaza, it's going to be the turn of the West Bank, because that's the only logical thing. It has nothing to do with value judgment. It's purely, the internal logic of the action, unless Hezbollah provokes them or they provoke Hezbollah in another confrontation in Lebanon. So what do you expect will happen there?
Well, look, I mean, I actually think this vote is symbolic. I don't think this vote has any practical implications.
I see. Do you think it's symbolic?
Yeah, the practical steps are being taken, however, irrespective of this vote. So you have now a minister, Smotrich, who is Minister of Finance, but is also a minister within the Ministry of Defense. And so he's basically in charge of the West Bank. That's what he wanted. Now, that's part of what the ICJ says, because if it is an occupied territory, then as an occupied territory, it's the military that should be in charge of it, not a civilian minister. So it's only the Minister of Defense, but he is in charge of it. And he is definitely, what he wants to do and what he's trying to do is to incite more and more violence there, so as to be able to cleanse
Right.
as much of that territory as
Right.
possible. I don't think it's going to be easy. I don't think the Palestinians are just going to get up and leave. They did that in 48. They're not going to repeat that, and they say that quite clearly. But the remote communities are now being already intimidated into leaving. And what Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have done, because Ben-Gvir is the Minister of Internal Security, they have basically given military uniforms to settlers. They've made settlers into soldiers. So when you see
Right.
settlers
Yes.
and soldiers, they're actually the same people. So from that point of view, I don't think this vote matters much. It was a symbolic vote. I agree with you that the general direction would be an attempt not only to completely empty Gaza of its population, or at least, as Israel has done already, empty the northern third of it, has already been basically flattened and emptied, but to also do it in the West Bank. I don't think it will be possible. I think that the result of a continuation of this kind of policy, if that is the direction, will be an increasing isolation of Israel. That Israel, yes, will be able to exercise a great deal of violence on Palestinians and not give them any rights, but it will continue the struggle with Hezbollah, which has basically devastated the Israeli north. The north now is destroyed. You can't even go there anymore. It will continue the struggle now with the Houthis, with Iran, with militias. It will become increasingly isolated. And ultimately, that will mean that it will become a full apartheid state, not only apartheid in the West Bank, as the ICJ already defined it, but generally it'll become an apartheid state. And, the international community moves very slowly. It's not so easy to change the policies of an independent sovereign country. And it could go on for a while. It'll become impoverished. There will be very little remnants of democracy in Israel. There is already a great deal of internal violence, Jews on Jews. The police has become increasingly violent in demonstrations and so forth. That is something that can happen. And, it could last 2-3 decades. I think eventually, as happened with South Africa, this will implode. But it'll take a long time. And during that time, a lot of people will suffer and a lot of people will die. Now, there is another way of thinking about the future, but that will not happen internally on its own. We have no political leadership now from the Palestinians, and we certainly have no political leadership from Israel, which is obviously the overwhelming force there to change the political paradigm. The only way to change the political paradigm, as we talked before, to say the occupation is the issue, you have to resolve this. You will not resolve anything else without resolving this. The only way to do that is either from the outside, that is, that there will be major intervention by the US and European powers that Israel is dependent on, especially, of course, on the US, or more unfortunately, that Israel will have to come to terms with the limits of its own power. And sadly, although Israelis feel that they've suffered a lot, and they have suffered, they have not suffered enough to understand that the way they're leading their country today, the kind of government that they are allowing to have in power, is destroying their own existence. And the way they will understand it, if it's not from the outside, is when there's not just one, drone that lands in Tel Aviv that shook everybody up, but hundreds of them. When Israelis understand that they are leading, that their government, their leaders, with their stubborn refusal to actually have a political plan for the war, that the war cannot just be a war in which we destroy our enemies, but a war in which at the end of which a particular political arrangement is made. If Israelis don't understand that, don't force the government to do it, then they'll have to face up to the consequences. And they're not doing it yet. Most of the demonstrators are not talking about that yet. And unfortunately, the government can continue because there's not enough pressure on it from within.
Well, as it was one of our listeners said in Italian, and I have to translate it just in English, but I think you understand perfectly. What the landscape, the future, the portrait you're giving is terrifying. Let's try to close up on. I understand it may be a rhetorical question because at the end, the key is in weapons. At least, I agree with you that the horizon is decades and not years. There's no sense even in thinking, this is a monstrosity that's been building up for now more than 100 years. I don't know where we want to date it, if the Balfour Declaration or even before, but certainly at least a century. So we're talking about decades in front of us. And during those decades, at the end, the key is going to be military power. And as long as the US military power, for strategic reason, or also for the relevance of the Jewish lobby in the US, backs whatever government goes up in Israel, no matter how brutal it is, then the military game at least, has no history, even if it will bring major suffering, a major disaster to Israel. But do you think Europeans have any angle or any relevance in all this? As a trade partner for Israel, they're actually more important than the US, not as a military and political partner, but as you having a better knowledge than I do of the Israeli society. Is there any leverage the European countries have, or is it essentially irrelevant?
No, of course they do. Of course they do. First of all, look, I mean, even just on obviously the U.S. is the main supplier of arms and so forth, but 20% of arms supplies to Israel come from Germany. The entire Israeli Navy is made by Siemens, which is kind of ironic because Siemens had a role in the Holocaust too. But the submarine fleet, the warships are made in Germany. In fact, that's part of Netanyahu's bribery case, because he took all kind of money to buy more submarines. There's a whole complicated story there.
As if
So
Israel
even on
needed submarines.
Yeah, I mean, there was a bribery case with Siemens, and we won't go into the details, but there is a case
No, I was
there
just being ironic, saying as if Israel needed submarines for its defense.
Well, there is actually, that's a whole other issue. You'd be surprised, but there is a whole military doctrine that Israel needs to have second strike abilities. Israel has nuclear weapons. Those
No, I
nuclear
understand. So
weapons
the
can
idea
be
is that if
carried by the
Iran
submarines.
attacks us, we have the submarines that send in
Voila.
somewhat a copycat of the American second strike policy.
Exactly. And submarines, near Iran and so forth. So,
Yeah.
but in any case, but of course, Europe is important economically, very important to Israel economically. The opening up of the European market to Israel was part of the opening up of the Israeli economy. So economically, it's very important. It's also culturally very important. I mean, for Israelis, Europe is, so to speak, their backyard. And you hear a lot in Israel now, people saying how uncomfortable they are going to Europe now because Europeans don't like them anymore. and they have to go to Thailand or someplace or India because they're not liked in Europe. Israel has become part of many associations, sports associations, cultural associations, and of course universities. So Europe is actually very important. But look, I mean, if there were to be, and there can be, major pressure on Israel, it would have to start with the United States. And the United States would have to work together with Germany, Britain, and France, not in order to bring Israel down, but actually in order to bring it back to the kind of normality that will make it possible for it to continue and flourish. I always think, about such cases as France. France really wanted to hold on to its colonial territories. It had to leave Indochina and left it to America, and then the Americans got
Did what they
bogged down
did in
there.
Vietnam.
And then, yes, and then it wanted to keep Algeria, and it had a terrible war in Algeria, and it killed hundreds of thousands of people, and many thousands of French soldiers were killed there. And the government, there was assassination attempts against de Gaulle, and France was completely torn up by that thing. And then it finally left Algeria. And that was the moment when France could finally come out of World War II and begin to modernize. It was only in the 1960s that France starts becoming a modern state where people actually like to live, a nice, good place to live in. Now, of course, we know that things have again gone north, but that's another issue. And Israel, if it could resolve this issue, if it could come to terms with the Palestinian population, most of whom want it, most of whom just want to live a normal life, just like most Jewish Israelis, if they could resolve that issue between them, their lives would be far better. Both sides would live a much better life, but they can't think through that. They have to be forced into it. They have not produced the right leadership for themselves, and the world has largely ignored it and let them get on with it. And I think right now, because we see how things can deteriorate so quickly in the rest of the Middle East, it is time, in fact, for a new American leadership, which we hopefully will have, and for major European countries to actually push in that direction, not because they're anti-Israeli, but because they actually want to help that state finally resolve these issues.
Well, I appreciate your words of hope. We work on that. I have to be. I mean, as you briefly said before we started the live. It's going to take decades if anything happens. But that doesn't imply we shouldn't try, and we shouldn't try to make people understand the reality of things. Listen, Omer. Maybe we'll have to talk again if you are available. I mean, this thing is not going to be, and keeping an update. And your voice is particularly calm, lucid, and precise. So I appreciate very much.
Thank you, Michele. Hope to see you in Italy at some point.
Well, let me know. I'm here. Well, I have to come back to US in August, but then I'm here again until middle of October. In case you come around, you're most welcome.
Okay.
Take good care. Thanks. Enjoy Cambridge.
Bye.
Thank you. Good evening. Bye. All right. Bene, grazie a Omer, grazie a tutti. Niente, ci si vede più tardi, quando un attimo, fra una mezz'oretta, 40 minuti, adesso devo finire delle cose, breve riflessione sul nuovo ticket della situazione americana. Un abbraccio a tutti, ciao, mettete i like, fate i bravi, anche chi ascolta dopo, fate girare, mi sembra che le cose che Omer Bartov ci ha raccontato siano di una certa rilevanza. Grazie e buona serata.